Administering test scores. The process of test administration has crucial importance to students, teachers, schools, and researchers because test scores will have serious implications for all of them. Precisely, test administration could influence the test reliability and give false scores as a result. Careful considerations should be considered when it comes to examiners, proctors, test takers, and rooms. Examiners. Examiners are people like teachers who use tests to examine students in content related to the test. The examiner could also be the test developer. It should be out of the question that examiners are familiar with the test instructions, know how to read them, and are capable of using any equipment related to test taking. Oral examiners in particular should be trained well. Proctors. Proctors are people who watch the test takers or the examinees while they are taking the test. They should be familiar with what the students can do, what they are not allowed to do, and what materials the test takers are authorized to use, like dictionaries, calculators, etc. Proctors can easily turn a test unreliable if they do not observe the exam rules. Test takers. Test takers or examinees are the individuals who are asked to provide answers to the items of the test. They need to receive clear instructions about the venue of the test, allowed materials and equipment, and where to sit exactly. Test takers or examinees should know what is appropriate for them to do during the test and what is prohibited. They should arrive before the beginning of the test. Rooms. Rooms should be spacious to allow test takers to sit far from one another. Test rooms should be well equipped with the necessary materials and equipment like proper lighting, proper ventilation, pencils, erasers, scantrons, scratch papers, etc. The test administrator or the location where the test must be administered must protect the test's security and value by guarding them against improper use and distribution. Materials should be stored in locked files or storage cabinets that are accessible only to authorized personnel. No reproduction of test materials is allowed in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical. The materials should be released only to persons who are qualified to interpret them and to use them properly, who have a professional responsible interest in their use, and who agree to safeguard their security and integrity. Test environment. The environment selected for administering standardized assessments should parallel the classroom environment as closely as possible. Standardized tests should be administered to classroom-size groups of about 25 students. In larger groups, the test administrator should have one assistant for every 25 students. Because students seem to perform better when they are familiar with the test administrator, the persons administering the tests should, if possible, be the student's own classroom teachers. Any person who assists the test administrator should also be familiar to the students. The testing room environment. The physical conditions of the room should be carefully controlled during testing. Students should be seated in an arrangement that prevents them from seeing the work of other students. The students' desks and workspaces should be clear with sufficient room for the test booklets and the answer sheets. Cover any materials and information on the walls, bulletin boards, and chalkboards that might help students to answer the questions. Testing materials. Persons administering educational assessments may be required to supply certain materials that students need to complete the assessment. For example, most educational assessments require test booklets, answer sheets, soft lead pencils, and scratch paper. The directions for administering may also specify materials required by the persons administering the assessment. Extra materials required by the students should be kept on hand and distributed as necessary. A Do Not Disturb sign should be available to hang on the door to the testing room. Assessment standardization. The way in which an assessment is administered to the students is especially important for standardized assessments. During the development process, standardization establishes uniform procedures for using the assessment so that the observation, administration, equipment, materials, and scoring rules will be the same for every student to whom it is administered. The goal of this uniformity is to make the assessment's results as objective as possible so that they can be considered valid and meaningful when used to compare the assessed qualities of students. If an assessment's results are perceived to have been significantly affected by external factors that occur before, during, or after its administration, they can feasibly be considered subject to different interpretations, thereby decreasing their informational value. Standardization attempts to control these external factors to the greatest degree possible so that the assessment is a valid measurement tool that produces meaningful results. Assessment accommodations. An assessment accommodation can be a change in format, response setting, timing, or scheduling that does not alter in any significant way that the test measures or the comparability of scores. A change to an assessment qualifies as an accommodation when it has been demonstrated as not invalidating a student's results. Accommodations that are appropriate are often detailed in the Individual Education Plan, or IEP, for a student with disability and should already be present in the classroom environment. Assessment modifications. In contrast, an assessment modification refers to a change in administration that alters the constructs assessed or the comparability of scores. When making changes to an assessment to meet a student's needs, policymakers at state education agencies or large school districts must determine whether the change is an accommodation or modification. If the change is an accommodation, then the scores can be compared to the scores of other students and aggregated with the norm group, if applicable. If the change is a modification, the student's results may need to be reported separately for those of the other students and can be compared only to the results of the students who were administered the test with the same modification. Professional responsibilities in assessment administration. Anyone administering an educational assessment to students is expected to assume certain responsibilities documented in the codes and standards of professional education organizations. Some general principles of appropriate conduct for persons administering assessments include protecting the safety, health, and welfare of all examinees, knowing and complying with relevant state and federal laws, maintaining and improving competence in educational assessment, and performing all responsibilities with honesty, integrity, due care, and fairness. The Code of Professional Responsibilities in Educational Measurement, the National Council on Measurement in Education, offers guidance for those who administered assessments, including the responsibilities to understand the procedures needed to administer the assessment prior to administration, to administer standardized assessments according to the prescribed procedures and conditions, and to avoid any conditions in the conduct of assessment that might invalidate the results. These standards of conduct are widely recognized and apply to anyone who takes the professional responsibility of administering an assessment to students. Preparing students for testing. The test administrator may also be responsible for preparing the students for the assessment. For students to give their maximum performance on an educational assessment, those who are responsible for administering the assessment must provide them with basic information that they require, including when the assessment will be administered, the content and abilities that will be assessed, what the assessment will emphasize, the standard of level of performance expected, how the assessment performance will be scored, and how the results of the assessment will be used to make decisions. Preparing test administrators for testing. Persons administering a standardized test should familiarize themselves with the materials and procedures well in advance of the testing periods. If permitted by the school district, they should carefully read and examine the directions for administering student test booklets, answer documents, and any other materials provided for testing. Reading directions. While administering the test administrator should read the directions exactly as written, using a natural, deliberate tone of voice and manner while enunciating clearly. The directions should not be repeated unless a mistake is made in the initial reading, or the directions for administering say to do so. The test administrator may attempt to clarify any directions that students do not understand and repeat the instructions if necessary. Except in the case of sample and practice items, the test administrator should not answer questions about the correct responses to specific test items. Here is an example of specific directions for assessing. Say, today we are going to do some interesting activities. I am going to give each of you a booklet. Leave your booklet closed until I tell you what to do. Open your booklet to page 2. Look at the group of words at the top of the page. Observing testing. During testing, the administrator and proctor should move around the room to observe the testing situation and to make certain that the students are following the directions, working on the correct tests, and marking the responses correctly on the answer sheet. The test administrator and assistants should be visibly engaged in the testing by observing all aspects of the process. If a student has trouble understanding what to do, the test administrator should try to explain the instructions quickly and quietly, but must not assist the student with responding to any specific items. Moreover, students must not help one another. Random responses and changing answers. Random marking of answer documents should be discouraged. Instead, students should be encouraged to respond to items for which they think they know the correct response. When changing answers, students should be reminded to erase the original mark thoroughly. Collecting test materials. At the end of a test sitting, test administrators should immediately collect all of the test booklets, answer sheets, and other testing materials from the students. Doing so is essential to maintaining the security of the testing materials. Moreover, This practice ensures that the testing materials for individual students are kept together so that they can be more easily accounted for and checked after test administration. The end.